What's up, guys? I'm DK, and you're watching Pro Wrestling What If, the series where I look at the different what if scenarios as terms of the world that we call professional wrestling. This weekend is AEW's big pay-per-view event, All In, at Wembley Stadium in London, England. And it actually dawned on me that prior to this event, AEW has done a total of 30 pay-per-view events prior to this event. So I thought for today's What If, I'm going to determine what the main event would be had it not been the main event it actually was for each and every single AEW pay-per-view event that has happened since its inaugural event in 2019, all the way until the most recent one as of the recording of this video. And not gonna lie, this was very difficult because it seems like with at least 90% of the events, that when you look at a card without knowing what's going to be the main event, you know what the main event is going to be. And if you end up enjoying this video, don't forget to hit that like button, share this to all your friends, subscribe, and press the notification bell for when future episodes get released, and leave a comment down below about today's topic or suggesting a future topic for an episode of Pro Wrestling What If. So the first event was Double or Nothing in 2019, in which the main event was Kenny Omega versus Chris Jericho, but had it not been that match, I think it would have been Cody versus Dustin Rhodes. Still to this day, in my opinion, this is the greatest AEW match in history. The story that was told between brother versus brother, a match we never actually properly got when both of them were in the WWE. And especially the way that the ending was with the promo segment was just the cherry on top of this amazing match. Fyter Fest 2019, the main event was Jon Moxley versus Joey Janela in the unsanctioned match, but had it not been that match, I think it would have been the Elite with Kenny Omega and the Young Bucks versus the Lucha Bros and Laredo Kid in the six-man tag team match. Now, this is one of those occasions where, of course, Moxley and Janela made sense considering A, the AEW World Championship didn't exist yet, and B, because the events that took place during the main event of Double or Nothing with Jon Moxley making his debut for the promotion. But this is also in the aspect that the Elite are considered some of the greatest wrestlers in the world that could make this match as the main event. Fight for the Fall in 2019, the main event was the Young Bucks versus Cody and Dusty Rhodes in a tag team match, but had it not been that match, I think it would have been Kenny Omega versus CIMA. Now, I'm going to allude to what I was kind of mentioning about the Fyter Fest match is the fact that because we have Kenny Omega involved in this match, and people do regard him as the best wrestler in the world that's active, that it wouldn't be surprising to see a lot of matches at this point have Kenny Omega as a part of the main event. All Out 2019, the main event was Adam Page versus Chris Jericho for the inaugural AEW World Championship, but had it not been that match, I think it would have been Cody versus Shawn Spears. Now, based off of storyline aspect, I think this definitely makes sense as the main event considering of the events that took place. I believe it was Fyter Fest, where Shawn Spears hits Cody over the head with the steel chair and had him laying in a pool of his own blood. Plus, with Cody being one of the top executives of AEW at the time, this kind of would have politicked his way maybe to being the main event. Full Gear 2019, the main event was Kenny Omega versus Jon Moxley in the unsanctioned Lights Out match, but had it not been that match, I think it would have been Cody versus Chris Jericho for the AEW World Championship. Now, at this point, of course, the AEW World Championship does exist, so you can make a valid reason for that to be the main event. Of course, it made sense for the Lights Out match to be the main event because of the events that took place earlier on in the year at Double or Nothing. But I think also with the stipulation of if Cody had lost the match that he wouldn't get a World Championship match again would have been very intriguing to see as turns to a main event match. Revolution 2020, the main event was Jon Moxley versus Chris Jericho for the AEW World Championship, but had it not been that match, I think it would have been the Young Bucks versus Adam Page and Kenny Omega for the AEW World Tag Team Championships. And I think this easily would have made sense as a main event besides the World Championship match, considering that all four of these competitors are a part of the group known as the Elite, and when 3 out of 4 of the competitors are the EVPs for AEW, then once again, kind of like what I mentioned with Cody, is that you could probably politic your way into making your match as the main event of the card. Plus, it probably, from what I last remember, was pretty banger of a match to where who really was going to top a match that featured the Young Bucks and Kenny Omega, whether on opposing sides or teaming together. Double or Nothing 2020, the main event was Matt Hardy and the Elite versus the Inner Circle Circle in the Stadium Stampede, but had it not been that match, I think it would have been Mr. Brody Lee versus Jon Moxley for the AEW World Championship. Now, of course, it made sense for such a crazy stipulation like Stadium Stampede to be the main event, and it seemed to be a mainstay stipulation for the next few years as turns to Double or Nothing. But had this match not existed, of course, it makes sense for the AEW World Championship to be the main event, plus the fact that Mr. Brody Lee had just made his debut for All Elite Wrestling a couple months prior. It would have made sense to build him up to be the main event in what I believe was his first pay-per-view for AEW at this time. All Out 2020, the main event was MJF versus Jon Moxley for the AEW World Championship, but had it not been that match, I think it would have been FTR versus Adam Page and Kenny Omega for the AEW World Tag Team Championships. Once again, you have a match that features Kenny Omega, so it does scream main event, but of course, you do have FTR, who had just made their debut recently in AEW at this time, and even though I believe in this match, FTR did win the World Tag Team Championships, this is a match where I believe you can get away with having this as the main event, considering that the AEW audience is very different compared to the WWE audience. Of course, with the WWE audience, it's more entertainment based, so having the good guys over the bad guys would make sense to send them home happy, but with AEW, it is more catered to the actual wrestling product, so if even the bad guys went over, if the match itself was great, that's how you send home the crowd of AEW happy. Full Gear 2020, the main event was Eddie Kingston versus Jon Moxley in an I Quit match for the AEW World Championship, but had it not been that match, I think it would have been MJF versus Chris Jericho. The MJF Chris Jericho storyline was one of the most entertaining storylines at this time, and especially with MJF on the rise as being one of the biggest homegrown talents in AEW, and Chris Jericho being one of the biggest names overall in AEW, this definitely would have screamed out main event potential, especially with the storyline involving MJF and Wardlow trying to join the Inner Circle, which was the stipulation involved in this match, which I do believe that MJF won this match and had inserted himself into the Inner Circle. Revolution 2021, the main event was Jon Moxley versus Kenny Omega in the exploding barbed wire death match for the AEW World Championship, but had it not been that match, I think it would have been MJF and Chris Jericho against the Young Bucks for the AEW World Tag Team Championships. Oh, the time of the exploding barbed wire death match, where it wasn't really exploding, it was just a bit of sparklers. I'm sure that AEW kind of regrets putting on this stipulation with how that turned out, but I did have a couple of different options to replace this as the main event, including the Sting and Darby Allin against Team Taz street fight. However, I feel that AEW wouldn't have wanted to put a cinematic match as the main event, especially because we did start seeing audiences come back for wrestling shows at this time, with the ongoing storyline involving MJF being a part of the Inner Circle, and then now him and Jericho trying to get the tag team championships. This storyline, along with one of the greatest tag teams in the Young Bucks, could have stolen the show as the main event, and this match so happened to actually be the opening match of the event. Double or Nothing 2021, the main event was the Inner Circle versus the Pinnacle in the Stadium Stampede, but if that wasn't the main event, I think it would have been the Orange Cassidy, Pac, and Kenny Omega triple threat match for the AEW World Championship. Now, we know that the Stadium Stampede is automatically going to be the main event of the show, but had that stipulation never existed, of course I think that the AEW World Championship would be in the main event slot. All Out 2021, the main event was Christian Cage versus Kenny Omega for the AEW World Championship, but had it not been that match, I think it would have been CM Punk versus Darby Allin. Of course, CM Punk had not only made his debut, but returning to professional wrestling for the first time in 7 years at this point. And a lot of people do regard CM Punk as the biggest draw in AEW history, and with this All Out match with Darby Allin being his first match in the company, they could have made a huge deal out of this as terms to making it the main event, just like how when Jon Moxley had appeared at the end of Double or Nothing, his match with Joey Janela at the following pay-per-view ended up being the main event. So it would have made sense for this realistically to be the main event had it not been Christian Cage versus Kenny Omega. Full Gear 2021, the main event was Adam Page versus Kenny Omega for the AEW World Championship, but had it not been that match, I think it would have been the Inner Circle versus Men of the Year and American Top Team in the Minneapolis Street Fight. Now, of course, seeing the successful multi-man street fight tag team matches we've seen with example Stadium Stampede and later on Anarchy in the Arena, that I wouldn't have been surprised that if they took a storyline like this and made it the main event. Revolution 2022, the main event was Adam Cole versus Adam Page for the AEW World Championship, but had it not been that match, I think it would have been CM Punk versus MJF in the dog collar match. One of the biggest things that got people excited about CM Punk's debut was the possibility of an interaction with MJF. And of course, that huge promo battle they had not only met our expectations, but probably exceeded them also. And so finally, when they have a match, especially with the stipulation like the dog collar match, I think this definitely should have been one of those cases that this match should have been the main event rather than the World Championship match. Double or Nothing 2022, the main event was CM Punk and Adam Page for the AEW World Championship, but had it not been that match, I think it would have been the Blackpool Combat Club versus the Jericho Appreciation Society in the Anarchy in the Arena match. And I think that match would have definitely made sense because the prior 2 years were both of the Stadium Stampede matches as the main event. So I'm really surprised that in this case they didn't keep that tradition going, but of course, with a huge draw like CM Punk in the main event, it would make sense for him, especially going after the World Championship and seeing him win the title that night, to be the main event. The AEW New Japan Pro Wrestling Forbidden Door 2022 event, the main event was Jon Moxley versus Hiroshi Tanahashi for the interim AEW World Championship, but had it not been that match, I think it would have been the four-way match with Adam Cole, Adam Page, Kazuchika Okada, and Jay White for the IWGP World Championship. Now, normally I would rather have, of course, a title from AEW be the main event, but of course, because this is an event also co-hosted by New Japan Pro Wrestling, that realistically, if one world title wasn't on the line, that it should have been the other regardless of the company that's involved with. I think this would have been perfectly fine as the main event of this event. All Out 2022, the main event was CM Punk versus Jon Moxley for the AEW World Championship, but had it not been that match, I think it would have been Bryan Danielson versus Chris Jericho. The big money match between two former WWE superstars, to where I think this would have made sense based off of name value to be the main event. Full Gear 2022, the main event was MJF versus Jon Moxley for the AEW World Championship, but had it not been that match, I think it would have been Saraya versus Dr. Britt Baker, DMD. Now, one of the things that I realized that I hadn't done yet while making this video is actually have a women's match be the main event of a pay-per-view, which I feel like this would have been the most likely one at this point to actually be the main event of a pay-per-view, especially when you have Saraya returning in the ring for the first time since 2017 from her neck injury, and then you have literally the top homegrown women's talent in AEW with Dr. Britt Baker, DMD, in this match, to where this had a lot of people talking, and it would have added hype to see if Saraya still had it in the ring and could have been a main event match. Revolution 2023, the main event was Bryan Danielson versus MJF in the 60-minute Iron Man match for the AEW World Championship, but had it not been that match, I think it would have been Adam Page versus Jon Moxley in the Texas Death Match. Now, of course, the Iron Man match made a whole hell of a lot of sense to be the main event because who else is going 60 minutes in the ring? But I think for the aspect that there'd be so much blood in the ring so that you don't have to constantly switch the canvas, even though I believe just like WWE, AEW does have multiple canvases to switch basically after every match. I could be wrong though. Double or Nothing 2023, the main event was the Elite versus Blackpool Combat Club in the Anarchy in the Arena match, but had it not been that match, I think it would have been the four-way match for the AEW World Championship featuring Darby Allin, Jungle Boy, Sammy Guevara, and MJF, the pillars of AEW. And that's basically my big point of why I think this could have been the main event, is because you're showcasing what was dubbed as the pillars of AEW, the future of AEW, and that would have been a showcase to show off as the main event. Then the AEW New Japan Pro Wrestling Forbidden Door 2023 event, the main event was Bryan Danielson versus Kazuchika Okada, but had it not been that match, I think it would have been Will Ospreay versus Kenny Omega for the IWGP United States Championship. Championship. Now, if you know your wrestling history, you know of the prior matches that Will Ospreay and Kenny Omega have had in the past. And although it made 100% sense by having two of the best wrestlers in the world at that time of Okada and Bryan Danielson go off against each other as the main event, then with the United States Championship match, you would have that plus the storyline involving Don Callis, who had turned his back on Kenny Omega at this point, and I believe Will Ospreay did win the title back in this match. All in 2023, the main event was Adam Cole versus MJF for the AEW World Championship, but had it not been that match, I think it would have been Samoa Joe versus CM Punk for the real AEW World Championship. Now, I think it had a lot of people talking at this time about CM Punk bringing the quote-unquote real AEW World Championship to AEW. Of course, because when he originally held the championship, he was forced to vacate it due to injury, and then when he had won it back at All Out, of course, the infamous brawl had happened to where CM Punk was suspended and then basically still held the AEW World Championship at that point. So I was really curious to see how this storyline was going to go with CM Punk holding the real World Championship, and especially with a match with Samoa Joe, which we hadn't seen since the Ring of Honor days, would have been intriguing to see as the main event. This is one of those cases, like I mentioned with, I believe, the 2022 Forbidden Door event. If one world title isn't the main event, it should have been the other world title, even though this world title is technically non-existent, actually. All Out 2023, the main event was Jon Moxley versus Orange Cassidy for the AEW International Championship, but had it not been that match, I think it would have been Bryan Danielson versus Ricky Starks in the no disqualification strap match. This event was a little bit complicated since I believe this was the time where AEW officially fired CM Punk, and I feel like because this event was happening in Chicago, that CM Punk storyline was intended to be the main event of the show. But had it not been one of the mid-card titles like the international title as the main event, I think that having a gimmick match like a strap match involving Bryan Danielson and Ricky Starks should have been the main event, especially when Bryan Danielson is bringing up the point that the last time that he had a strap match was with a close dear friend of his, referring to his strap match with the Fiend Bray Wyatt at Royal Rumble 2020 while in WWE. Wrestle Dream 2023, the main event was Darby Allin versus Christian Cage in the 2 out of 3 falls match for the AEW TNT Championship, but had it not been that match, I think it would have been the Don Callis family versus Chris Jericho and the Golden Elite Trios match. Now, of course, the biggest reason of the TNT title match being the main event was, of course, of the eventual debut of Adam Copeland in AEW. But based off of storyline value, I think it would have made sense for the Trios match to be the main event, Chris Jericho and Kenny Omega, even though they aren't exactly the best of friends, that they can unite together with, of course, Kota Ibushi to take on the Don Callis family and try to end them once and for all. Full Gear 2023, the main event was Jay White versus MJF for the AEW World Championship, but had it not been that match, I think it would have been the Golden Jets versus the Young Bucks. Now, once again, based off of storyline's sake, that I think this definitely makes sense. Kenny Omega and Chris Jericho becoming a tag team, and the name definitely makes sense because of both of them being from Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada, and the Jets is the hockey team for Winnipeg for NHL. And especially with the storyline that had the Golden Jets had lost, that they would be forced to break up, which, if memory serves me correctly, they did win this match, so they were able to continue their tag team. World's End 2023, the main event was Samoa Joe versus MJF for the AEW World Championship, but had it not been that match, I think it would have been the Adam Copeland Christian Cage no DQ match for the TNT Championship. Now, we know what had ended up happening at the end of the AEW World Championship match with the reveal of Adam Cole being the devil, which is why this definitely made sense as the main event. But when you have a match that people have been waiting for a long time that we never actually really got as terms to WWE between Adam Copeland and Christian Cage, this definitely would have made sense as the main event, especially adding that shocking value of somehow having Christian finding a way to actually win back the AEW TNT Championship. Revolution 2024, the main event was the Young Bucks versus Sting and Darby Allin in a tornado tag match for the AEW World Tag Team Championships, but had it not been that match, I think it would have been the triple threat match with Adam Page, Swerve Strickland, and Samoa Joe for the AEW World Championship. Now, of course, in most senses, the World Championship match definitely deserves to be the main event. But of course, at this point, this was the retirement match for Sting, and the whole show was revolved around Sting's final match. So had Sting not planned on retiring from professional wrestling at this point, that I think it would have made sense for the triple threat match to be the main event. Dynasty 2024, the main event was Swerve Strickland versus Samoa Joe for the AEW World Championship, but had it not been that match, I think it would have been Will Ospreay versus Bryan Danielson. One of those matches that people have been wanting for such a long time, and people not knowing whether it was actually going to be happening considering of Bryan Danielson's career in WWE, and of course Will Ospreay spending a lot of his time in New Japan Pro Wrestling, that we never thought they would actually finally meet in a ring once and for all. So had this been the main event, I think this would have sent the crowd home happy regardless of the result, because the match would have been absolutely amazing. Double or Nothing 2024, the main event was Team AEW versus the Elite in the Anarchy in the Arena match, but had it not been that match, I think it would have been the Christian Cage versus Swerve Strickland match for the AEW World Championship. Once again, this is the case of if the Anarchy in the Arena or Stadium Stampede match never existed as a stipulation, then realistically the World Championship match would have main evented the show. Especially when you have one of the hottest heels in AEW of Christian Cage, who's always talking about your dead dad, going up against the newly crowned AEW World Champion and very popular champion as terms to Swerve Strickland. The AEW New Japan Pro Wrestling Forbidden Door 2024 event, which the main event was Will Ospreay against Swerve Strickland for the AEW World Championship, but had it not been that match, I think it would have been Mercedes Moné against Stephanie Vaquer in the winner takes all match for the AEW TBS and New Japan Pro Wrestling Strong Women's Championship. Now I think this definitely makes sense for the sake of course, a winner takes all stipulation. And you do have a big enough women's star as terms to Mercedes Moné, formerly known as Sasha Banks, to have her possibly be the main event of a show. Also, if you so happen to watch this video after the All In event, or perhaps the All Out event, because they're both back-to-back weekends, that I am eventually going to be making a part 2 of this video, so stay tuned for when that video eventually releases on this channel.